Good afternoon, everybody. Uneducated Economist here. So, we've been talking a lot about inflation and deflation, but all the word on the street, everybody's talking about inflation. And the inflation expectation is now very high. Like, everybody's convinced. And, I just kept thinking something was eating at me, and I just couldn't figure out what it was. It was just kept going through my head, and I'm like, man, I got to go back and I got to read some of the stuff that I had gone through before. And something kept gnawing at me, and I finally figured it out. It was this speech that I had talked about back in the early days of the channel, but it's this Federal Reserve speech, and I'll leave a link down in the description for you guys. It was John Williams, the New York Fed president. And before I talk about this little section in this speech, let me bring up a couple of things. One of them is, remember Donald Trump screaming at the Federal Reserve saying that the Fed should be printing money and dropping interest rates and that there was no inflation? I mean, you remember he was wanting to fire Jerome Powell. There's no inflation. The Fed should be printing money. He was saying it over and over and over again. Keep that in mind. The other thing to keep in mind is the credible threats. Now, if you follow my channel for any length of time, you know all about credible threats. But if you're new to my channel, credible threats is something that we have talked about as far as the main tool of the Federal Reserve. They call it jawboning or forward guidance, but ultimately it's it's easiest to describe with a story. So if you could imagine a guy who invents a gold machine, and with this gold machine, he can produce as much gold at will with very little cost or energy. The moment that this information gets out to the public that this guy has invented this machine, the price of gold on the markets would plummet, even before the guy produces a single ounce of gold. Just the credible threat alone would be enough to move the markets. So that is what the Federal Reserve is using now for their main policy tool. And like I said, they call it jawboning or forward guidance or whatever, but that's ultimately what it is. Now, keep those two things in mind. Let me read this little section here. And it's not the whole speech, it's just a small section out of it. But it goes like this. This downward shift in inflation expectation has a second-round effect on real interest rates, the economy, and inflation. When policy is constrained by the effective lower bound, the downward shift in inflation expectation raises the real interest rate, further diminishing the degree of monetary stimulus, making the downturn worse and reducing inflation even more. Even in times when policy is not constrained, the expectation of below target inflation in the future affects current decisions, putting additional downward pressure on inflation. In other words, monetary policy is always swimming upstream, fighting a current of too low inflation expectation that interferes with achieving the target rate. Now, the Fed is famous for having what they refer to as Fed speak, where they'll say a bunch of words, but nobody really quite understands what they're saying. So let's break this down a little bit. The downward shift in inflation expectation has a second-round effect on real interest rates, the economy, and inflation. So now I think that's kind of interesting the way they say that. The inflation expectation, because it's not so much about inflation. I mean, we don't need to argue about whether or not we have inflation. Inflation is the expansion of money and credit. It has already happened. The whole idea of inflation has already occurred. What we are not seeing is the price inflation in the way that the Federal Reserve wants to see it. So that's what we're looking for. It doesn't matter what we think. We can point at houses and lumber and everything else and say, look at all the inflation. That's not what the Federal Reserve is looking at. They're looking at something completely different from that, and it doesn't matter because they're the ones who are basically the ones who are in charge of the monetary policy. So whatever they see it, that's the way it is. Now, I know a lot of people are going to argue with that, but it doesn't matter. Like I said, they're the ones who are in charge of the monetary policy. But now, if you think about this, downward shift in inflation expectation has a second-round effect on real interest rates, the economy, and inflation. When policy is constrained by the effective lower bound, the downward shift in inflation expectation raises the real interest rate. Now that's interesting. So if inflation expectation in the future goes down, the real interest rate goes up. Now, I thought about that for a minute. It was like, okay, so if I was an investor and I was anticipating a 3% return, but I have an expectation of a 1% inflation, then my real interest rate is 2%. So if my inflation expectation drops, the real interest rate rises. There's no inflation! The Fed should be printing money! Remember that? All right. Now, this is something. Let me go back and read that sentence again and then add the next sentence into it. When policy is constrained by the effective lower bound, the downward shift in inflation expectation raises the real interest rates, further diminishing the degree of monetary stimulus, making the downturn worse and reducing inflation even more. So think about it the opposite. If the downward shift in inflation expectation raises the real interest rates and further diminishes the degree of monetary stimulus, well, then the upward shift in inflation expectation would lower the real interest rates and further increase the degree of monetary stimulus. Think about it. Inflation, inflation, inflation. Warren Buffett saying there's inflation. Federal Reserve says they're going to let inflation run extra hot for extra long. Everybody is under the impression that there's going to be inflation. In fact, they will call you stupid if you say anything other than there's going to be inflation. Do you think they've raised the inflation expectation? It's very interesting, huh? When you think about it like this. Let's continue on. Let's see here. Even in times when policy is not constrained, the expectation of below target inflation in the future affects current decisions. So exactly opposite. Even in times when policy is constrained, like it is now, the expectation of higher target inflation in the future would also affect current decisions, putting upward pressure on inflation. That's if you read it opposite, because really it reads, even in times when policy is not constrained, the expectation of below target inflation in the future affects current decisions, putting additional downward pressure on inflation. So if you read that backwards, or basically read that as the opposite, instead of having an inflation expectation that is below target, if you had an inflation expectation that was above target, in the future it would affect current decisions by putting upward pressure on inflation. So it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. See, if you have $100 sitting in the bank and you're thinking, the $100 ain't enough, let me go up higher. $100,000 sitting in the bank, and you're thinking, man, there's no inflation, then there's no point in moving your money. But if all of a sudden you have this anticipation that there's going to be inflation, like everybody says there's going to be inflation, well, you better get your money out and do something with it pretty quick. And what happens when you do that? It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. This is interesting stuff that we're going through here. This is mass psyops. This is one of the reasons why I don't fall for any of this stuff. It's just like, you got to sit back and you got to look, and you're like, especially working retail, it's easier to see. Everybody's screaming inflation. When they go down to the grocery store, they look for things that are extremely expensive. They're looking for the inflation. They're looking for prices to go up. They're anticipating it, and now they want to see it. They want to confirm it. And then they're going to go and make sure that it happens. When the whole time, I've been saying, it seems to me that it's more of a supply constraint, meaning that it's hard to ship stuff around and that it's not flowing the way it should be. Lumber is a perfect example of it. How many videos and pictures have we seen with stacks of lumber everywhere, but yet the prices can continue to climb, and hitting another high today of $1,600 per thousand. I mean, I choke on it because when I saw that happen, I went to the buyer and I said, man, our retail price is right now 3 cents below the futures price. Do you understand that? And he says, okay, I'll fix that. He got the updated pricing to get to our current market value, which is what you do, because if you sell these 2x4s, you need to replace them. You can't just go and, you got to have like what the replacement cost is. It went from $8.49 to $11.09. We are selling a 2x4 8 for $11.09. I mean, it's beyond, like, I mean, if there was ever a time where somebody should point at something and say that there's hyperinflation, it would be in lumber. It's not there. That's not inflation. That's not what's happening at lumber. Lumber is in complete supply constraint. It is not flowing through the country the way it needs to, and the people who need it will pay any price for it. Any price. When that frees up, when that supply begins to flow through, we are not going to be seeing the same things we're seeing right now. It will change. People do not want to pay $11 for a 2x4/8. To give you an example, I priced out a single exterior wall, 20 feet long, built out of 2x6s, 104 5/8 KD studs, sheeted, $880. That's only studs and plate and sheathing. That's not doors, that's not windows, that's not headers, that's not none of that stuff. And it was $880. Think about it. A 20-foot by 20-foot box, just the walls. Not the floor, not the roof, not even really enough sheathing to do it. And it will be almost just shy of $5,000. And people are telling me that there's going to be a booming building season? I don't think so. Uneducated Economist. You guys let me know.